Well, hey friends, welcome back to another night as we continue our study of cities in the biblical world. I will go ahead and say on the front end that these videos, try as I might to do them every week, are probably going to be a bit hit and miss. More weeks than not, they will be up, but I have taken on some additional, there's some other stuff that I've had to get done, and these videos are just sounds bad to say, but not as high up on the priority list. I've been doing some work with our youth group, and I'm putting time and effort and energy into that one. And so having the time to sit down each week and plow through the type of material that I have to go through in order to, ensure that the information I'm giving you as I talk about these cities is important and substantial and interesting, it takes time, and that's not time I'm having each and every week. So if I miss a week, it's because I've been doing youth group stuff, and just wait around and give me a week, and hopefully I'll be able to catch back up. It's actually where I'm recording this video right now. I don't know why it took me this long to realize that there was a whole stinking basement to use, and that I didn't have to do it in my office and hide the phone and deal with background noise and distraction there, when I could just, hide and take care of it this way. The giant downside right now is that in the kitchen, that is 20 feet that direction of where I'm currently sitting, I'm cooking dinner for the youth group tonight, and all I am smelling right now is carne asada. So I want to eat my foot. So hopefully I will be able to restrain myself from going in there and tearing into food very early today. And you don't have to worry about that because you can't smell what's going on. If you would like to follow along with the story in the text as we look at it tonight, you can grab a Bible and turn to Acts chapter 16, which carries kind of our historic telling of what happens in the city of Philippi, separate from the letter to the Philippians, which gives us a little bit of information, but not a ton about the city. However, as we've been doing these, it has been more about the history of the town itself, and then I've highlighted where those things connect with the text, and that will continue to be our pattern. Of course, I need to now turn a page because that's what I wrote on Ephesus, and we've already done that one. So Philippi. Philippi is a relatively young town in comparison to the other towns that we talk about in this series and in the first century world in general. We've talked about Rome, and we've talked about Jerusalem, we've talked about Ephesus and Corinth, these places that have fairly significant historical setting and old populations that have been there for 1,000 years by the time our New Testament gets written. And that's not really the case with Philippi. Philippi is a relatively young city. It is nowhere near as populated as the other ones that I've talked about thus far. It is near a port city, but isn't itself a port city. It is not the place, home of any major empire. Its history gets started in the mid-4th century, and right after it becomes a city, it gets taken over by Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, as he begins kind of this Macedonian, this Greek conquest of the known world. Of course, what starts with Philip passes to Alexander, who's best known as the person who Hellenizes the entire world, which is a slight overstatement, but it's certainly the known world and parts of the world that weren't well known to his people at that time. And the reason it becomes a city at all, oops, nearly dropped that, is because it's in an incredibly valuable location, not by way of travel. Again, port city's 10 miles away, that's not a bad thing, but by way of local resources. There's an incredibly productive gold and silver mines that are just outside of town. It is a place that immediately becomes incredibly prosperous because of those resources. Very early on, it's minting its own coinage. It's and then only grows in importance as the Ignatian Way gets built. That's the east-west road that goes all the way across Greece and anyway, one of the major travel roads in the Roman world. And so by the time the Romans get there, it's already become an incredibly wealthy place. They are more than happy to mooch those resources. And because of its importance and because of its wealth, it kind of is treated with kid gloves. They don't want to tear up the local infrastructure as they make their way across the area. Really, though, for the Philippi of the first century, maybe the most important thing that happens to it happens after the assassination of Julius Caesar, when there's a battle between Julius's friends, those that are, I would say, trying to avenge him, but maybe it's better said those that see value in empire, and the Republicans and Brutus and Cassius. Antony and Octavian, defenders of Caesar or of their own pocketbooks, chase Brutus and Cassius kind of across the world, or across out of Italy and into Greece. This is where their armies have their big final battle where Antony and Octavian win, Brutus and Cassius are defeated. And because it's in this place receives honor. There's more to it than just that. Of course, they want to remember their victory, but they also have soldiers who they've made promises to and owe money to, and they need to come good on that. And so Philippi becomes this colony of Rome, this place of exceptional importance. It's populated with Roman soldiers who have participated in the victories of Antony and Octavian, who then turn around and fight each other across the next 11 years because you can't have two emperors. You're only going to have one, and they got to duke it out to see who wins, and Octavian becomes Augustus because he's able to defeat Mark Antony. And, of course, when that victory happens, not all that far from this location, he populates it with more of his retiring soldiers, who, of course, are incredibly grateful to Rome for everything that they have received in life, their land and their property and their position and authority and influence. And Philippi becomes this place 800 miles from Rome, but with special Roman status, populated with retired Roman soldiers who are certainly interested in the upkeep and maintenance and prominence of Rome, because that's where they invested their time, effort, energy. So it becomes this place that is, jokingly said, more Roman than Rome, where everything that isn't Roman is not allowed. And so that becomes incredibly important for Paul's missionary efforts there, as you see in the story in Acts 16. First and foremost, whenever it's time to figure out where the synagogue is, Acts 16 verse, I think 11 is kind of where this starts, 11, 12, 13. Paul goes to Philippi, and then when the Sabbath rolls around, he has to leave Philippi in order to find the place of worship for the very small number of Jewish people who are there. There's some disagreement over what all of this means and what we can infer, but I am of the opinion that the reason we see a group of women worshiping by the river is because Philippi is not home to enough Jewish people to constitute a synagogue, which requires 10 men in order for there to be a synagogue. And so because there are not 10 men, the women get together and worship by the river. River being a place, moving water being important in Jewish custom and ritual and purity. And so this was par for the course. When they built synagogues, they tried to build them by moving water when they could. Not only does it make it easier to refill the mikvahs, but also you have that moving water. It's there. It's easy access for those rituals and customs and practices. One of the reasons I think that there's no synagogue there is because Philippi was not a place you wanted to be if you were not hyper-Roman. Jews were not well regarded by imperialists, those who are, and maybe put it this way, the most popular worship in Philippi, as they kind of look at archaeology and record, it seems to be the worship of the imperial cult, emperors past and present. Philippi was a place where that was what was most prominent, and of course, if you were Jewish, you participated in none of that. And so you certainly stood out and were looked at judgmentally. As Jews, you had special status in the empire. They had taken care to make sure that there was space for people who were on the outside looking in as far as Roman customs go, where they didn't have to pay some of the taxes. They were able to substitute in the temple tax instead. And certainly they paid some taxes, but not all of them. And you can imagine that wasn't well liked by these retired Roman soldiers whose income and status and all of that stuff has been paid for by those taxes, and certainly want to continue to see those going to the government that's taking care of them. And then there's just a general distrust of those who will not worship your gods, because to worship the gods in Rome was to participate in civic life. There was no separation. Religion in the Roman world and religion as we understand it are simply not the same thing. It's not a one-to-one comparison. And there are a lot of differences between Jewish worship practices and how they understood God versus Roman worship practices and where they understood the role of the gods to be in all of that. All of that means that Jews were not overly welcome in Philippi, and a synagogue certainly wasn't. And I believe, I know I've read this in one or two of the articles that I've worked on more recently. I could not find those articles as I prepped for tonight, but there was a stone obelisk uncovered not all that long ago, a couple of miles outside of Philippi, and the inscription on it, I can't remember word for word what it said, but gave the impression that once you crossed that stele, once you went beyond it, you were in Roman territory, and that was the way you were to act, or you were to not be there at all. So you can understand with that sort of expectation and that sort of history why it may not be the most welcoming place to people who don't practice those customs and hold to those bonds and ties, and certainly do not revere the emperor in the same way that the locals did. And so therefore not a place where if you were Jewish you really wanted to live. And in fact, the person that we run into that Paul begins to convert first is a Gentile woman who's a fearer of God, and that looks like that's kind of the population of God-fearers there. Again, not a huge Jewish population. It's some Gentiles who have come into Jewish tradition and custom and practice and worship God, but not a huge, again, Jewish population that's here. And of course, then what happens in Philippi, if you continue reading chapter 16, is that Paul gets annoyed with this girl who has a spirit of divination. The literal translation there is something like a python spirit or a Pythia spirit. And if you know your Greek and Roman tradition, then you know that Pythia was the name of the oracle at Delphi, where the temple of Apollo, the main in the pantheon of the Roman gods, and the primary god of the Caesar, where she, Pythia, gave tellings of the future. That was that. And so when Paul calls it a Pythia spirit, there is immediately this connection to the power of the Roman world versus Paul's God. This conflict between Paul and this fortune-telling girl is not simply a conflict between Paul and a girl. The immediate impact is much bigger than that and is immediately understood by the people in the community, and I think by Paul in the early church, and of course then shared by Luke because of the nature of this conflict. When Paul casts out the spirit, the people who are there grab him, and the accusation that they level is, first and foremost, they identify them as outsiders. He's not one of us. This Jew is advocating for practices that are not Roman. That's the accusation that's leveled. And that tells you a lot about Philippi, especially because that accusation by itself is enough to gather a mob. Paul's then thrown in jail. This is the time when the jailer thinks they've all escaped, and Paul stops him from killing himself, saves his life, baptizes his family. And I hate to just gloss over that. We only have a couple of minutes here. I don't want to go too long. But the more important part of it for the story of Philippi comes next. It tells us a little bit more about the place, where they come out of the jail and they're ready to kind of usher them on. And Paul says, well, hold on just a second, because I'm a Roman citizen. And it never once crossed the mind of the local civic leaders that a Jew would be a Roman citizen. That's not to say that there weren't Jews who were Roman citizens, but in Philippi, that was almost unthinkable, or completely unthinkable. And they never bothered to ask because they wouldn't have thought it would be the case. And this is the moment where then they have, in an effort to squash Paul's un-Roman practice, have committed an un-Roman practice, which is irony at its finest. And they now have to issue a public apology to Paul, and they hope that this thing goes away quietly, and they tell him get out of town, and he doesn't get out of town before he goes and stops by and offers some encouragement. But even that tells you a little bit about the nature of the city of Philippi. So it's interesting the difference between Paul's ministry in Philippi and Paul's ministry in like Athens, where he can advocate for whatever he wants to, because this is a place where all ideas are welcome in Athens. And they're happy to talk and debate and think through, and it may not get anywhere, but they love the nature of ideas. Philippi is not that place. It is very much a place where if it is outside of their practices, it is unwelcome. It is not going to gain much ground. Of course, which makes it really interesting that this small town, at most a population of 10,000 people, that this small town becomes an important place in the early church, because the early church has to overcome a ton in order to get roots there, and it does. So I hope that information is interesting to you, that maybe as you read the book of Philippians or you read the story of Paul in Acts and his time in Philippi, that will provide some depth and some understanding to what you are reading. All right, I hope to be back next week with whatever city is next. I have no idea what that is. But again, my apologies if we miss a week, because I'm trying to make sure we've got stuff taken care of with teens. So, all right, thank you for joining us, and see you next time.